All right, so now that you're on page 141, we're going to talk about feeding a shrimp each day. So at an aquarium, a shrimp is fed 1/5 grams of food each feeding and is fed 3 times each day. So and some important information here is that we have 1/5 grams of food for each feeding, and we know that the shrimp is fed 3 times each day. So how much food does a shrimp get fed in one day? Well, we have the shrimp getting fed 1/5 grams at each feeding and gets fed 3 times a day. So that's like you eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the shrimp is going to get 1/5 grams of food for breakfast, and then another 1/5 gram for lunch, and then 1/5 more grams of food for dinner. So total, how much is the shrimp going to get fed? Remember, when we're adding fractions, the denominators need to be the same. Since they're all 5s, we keep the denominator the same. We do not add them. But we do add the top number. So we're going to add 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 3. So a shrimp will get fed a total of 3/5 of a gram every day. So we're going to complete the table to show how many grams of food the shrimp is fed over a different number of days. Well, let's look at the table. Our left column says number of days. Our right column says grams of food. So let's first make sure we know which one is X, which one is Y. If I think of the alphabet, X, Y, Z, I can just write it in the order of the alphabet. So X is on the left, Y goes on the right. We're going to need to come back to that here in a minute. So number of days that the shrimp needs to get fed. Well, one day the shrimp is going to get fed 3/5 gram of food. We already did that, so we can just fill it in. What about if the shrimp needs to be fed for 7 days? How can we figure out how much food that is? So let's look at how we go from 1 to 7. How are we going to be multiplying to get from 1 to 7? 1 times what equals 7? That's 7. So if I multiply this by 7, what am I going to multiply that by? We're also going to multiply this by 7. Okay, and we can use a calculator for that. When we are multiplying fractions, I'm going to put the work over here on the side so you can see what is happening when we use the calculator. So 3/5 times 7, right? It's easiest to multiply fractions to a fraction. So I can change the whole number 7 into a fraction by putting it over 1. Now, if you remember when we multiplied fractions, we just need to multiply across the top and then multiply across the bottom. 3 times 7, 21, over 5 times 1, which is 5. So a shrimp will get fed every 7 days. He'll get 21/5 grams of. So how do we know how much food the shrimp will eat in 30 days? Could we use the same process that we used to get from 1 to 7 and maybe go from 1 to 30? Yep. So what do I have to multiply 1 by to make it equal 30 in the end? By 30. So that means that I'm going to take this 3/5 and multiply that also by 30. 3/5 times 30 equals what? Okay, remember, any whole number I can turn into a fraction by putting it over 1. So 3 times 30 is 90. That's the numerator. 5 times 1, the denominator. So in 30 days, the shrimp will have eaten 90/5 grams of food. So what is the constant of proportionality on this table? We can look at where x equals 1. Remember, this is one of our strategies. If we're going to first look for a 1 on our table in the x column. If we have a 1 here, that means that we can look at the y column, and that is our constant of proportionality. If we don't have this 1 in the x column, we have to use y over x to solve. Luckily, we have it here. So 3/5 is our constant of proportionality. Remember that K is the variable that we use to represent this phrase. Okay, it's just a short way of doing it because mathematicians are lazy. What does 3/5 tell us about the situation? Okay, 3/5 just means that the shrimp will be fed blank grams of food each day. What number do you think goes here? The shrimp will be fed how much grams of food each day? Write this sentence and fill in the blank. Pause the video to do that now. Alright, next we're going to look at if the columns on the table were switched, what would be the constant of proportionality? So we can draw the table down here. Remember, x stays on the right, that's my left, sorry. X stays on the left, y stays on the right. We're now going to take our columns and switch them. So grams of food were originally on the y. I'm going to put them on the x. So I'm going to put food and then days. And then I'm going to bring the values that were under each column into our table. So we had, for our food, we had 3/5, 21/5, and 90/5. I'm going to put those over here, 21/5, 90/5. Our days were 1, 7, and 30, so I can fill in those days as well. Now we can find the constant of proportionality. First thing we do when we look at a table is look for a 1 in the x column. I do not have a 1 in the x column, so I cannot find the constant of proportionality this way. Don't get confused. If there's a 1 in the y column, this is not the constant of proportionality. So how do we find the constant of proportionality? Y over x. So I'm going to take 1 over 3/5. This looks really weird, right? I have a whole number divided by a fraction. We did dividing fractions. I can write 1 divided by 3/5. This was just copy dot flip, right? So I'm going to copy the 1, change the division to a multiplication, that was the dot, and then we're going to flip the next fraction. So instead of 3/5, I get 5/3. 5/3 times 1 equals 5/3. So our constant of proportionality, 5/3. And we know that because we did the math down here. Another thing we could have done, based off of our notes, was here I knew that when x is 1, this has to be a constant of proportionality. To find the other constant of proportionality, or the other equation, all I would have to do is take that 3/5 and switch the numbers around. That 3/5 switched, those numbers flipped over, right? So I didn't really have to do any of the notes down here, but if this is something that you need to do, it's fine. You're taking a little extra time, but it's not wrong, okay? Last thing we're going to do, we're going to write the equations for these two tables. Let's start with the first one, okay? So our directions say use D for number of days and F for amount of food in grams that a shrimp is fed to write two equations that represent the relationship between D and F. Ugh, that's a lot to say. So first step of the directions, use D for the number of days. So instead of writing number of days or using X, I'm going to use the variable D. And then it says use F for the amount of food in grams that a shrimp is fed. So instead of using Y, I'm going to use F. When we write an equation, we use Y equals KX. This is just the outline for our rule. Okay, so if I write Y equals KX on this line, I'm going to replace the K with my constant of proportionality, so that was 3/5. But our directions say to use different variables. I can't use X and Y. I have to use the D and the F. So I'm going to look back at my table. D was in the X column, so I'm going to go back to my equation, and where X is, I'm going to write D in that spot instead. So it's going to be right after that constant of proportionality. So we have 3/5 D. That means that F is with the Y, so I'm going to bring F over in front of my equal sign. So there's the equation for our first table. Let's look at the second one. Okay, remember F is for food, so I'm going to put F over here. I'm going to make it kind of big so it stands out. And D was for our days. So we're going to write the other equation. Remember, this constant of proportionality is the K in our equation. We're going to replace the K with this number now. You are going to write the equation here. Make sure that your equation has that constant of proportionality and is using F and D, not Y and X. When you're done writing that equation, you're going to go back to the bottom of your notes. You're going to create your own proportional relationship. So you're going to make your own table that you get to make up the labels, you get to make up the numbers. Just make sure that it's proportional. Make sure it's using the same constant of proportionality. Then what I need to see is you to write two equations that represent that relationship. Okay? If you need to look at page 141, use that as a guide. That the last steps for number 5 were exactly what you needed to do for your two equations. Raise your hand if you need help. When you are done with this page, you're going to write your name at the top and turn it into the turn-in bin.